Stop right there. It's very likely that you like this one, but hated this one. Why is that? Let's break it down. Water levels. What do I mean by water levels? I consider water levels to be levels, stages, missions, or quests that involve large bodies of water. So don't think so much cheap beach from Mario Kart Super Circuit where there's like a trace amount of water around. Instead, think of the Water Temple in Ocarina of Time, or Labyrinth Zone from Sonic the Hedgehog. Levels where the water introduces fresh movement, restrictions, and a completely new playstyle. A memorable one at least. The water in these levels is usually used to affect the player's character's movements, making them move slower, often with floating mechanics and effective increase to their jump height. These levels are video game tropes typically found in platformers, adventure games, and they're usually capitalized in these genres as well. So for this video, I just want to tackle on those video game genres, even though you could argue maybe, there's water levels in racing games, first-person shooter games, and fighting games. So let's circle back to my first question. Why is it that some water levels feel frustratingly good, yet some feel like a part of the game you never wish to play again? I'm going to go over what I consider to be the best water levels and the worst water levels, and why is it that they don't work and work. I'm Simon from the Panic Brothers. Josue, the other half, is also on the channel, as you probably already know if you're watching this video. We would appreciate any likes on this video or a subscribe. Any help matters. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Okay, let's start with the most prevalent use of water in video games: platformers. Let's start with something like Super Mario Bros., a game that I believe is a good representation of a not so bad yet not so great water level. Super Mario Bros. Is a classic and the blueprint for most platformers these days for a reason. It just works. It just does. When playing Super Mario Bros., the controls feel tight, the feedback is solid, any deaths or mistakes feel like they fall on the user more than the game being cheap or gimmicky. It's a very polished game that controls well to this day across its jump, sprint, and duck mechanics. Super Mario Bros. Has its first true water level, as we're defining it in this video, in the segment level 2-2. As soon as players enter this body of water, boom, just like that, the neat tight controls are gone. We now get a complete 180 in controls. Mario feels sluggish, his tight jump is now comparable to the tap of a Flappy Bird at best, and he's met with new underwater enemies that move quick and sporadic, making the new navigation system harder to control. And this isn't just seen in the first Mario game. Look at Mario 64. You hit the water and now the previously free and liberating platforming that was revolutionary for the 90s is completely gone. You now move much slower and a very much more restrictive pace around a new 360 access that introduces an even harsher contrast than that of the original game. This isn't to say this new mechanic is awful, as we should embrace new styles of gameplay and new mechanics all the time because they challenge the player and revolutionize gaming. However, this new system at times can be more frustrating than it can be challenging. Game mechanics can grow old very, very fast when not challenging or fun, like Pokemon or NBA 2K. Both of these games are examples of games that share mechanics that hardly ever change, and if they do, they're usually pretty gimmicky. Now, it's very easy for me as a consumer to say that these mechanics need to be revolutionized. However, game designers face a real problem when making these mechanics. They usually directly contradict the main gameplay, making people feel foreign to the experience and uninterested. Imagine a Sonic level where Sonic can't go fast, or imagine a Zelda level where Link can't fight or swing his sword. It's very easy for these segments to be hated and deemed boring by fans. I think this is the reason why people hate water levels so much. A lot of them are typically very contradictory to the main gameplay, and because of it, are not fun. They're very stupid, stale, and boring. I think a first good example is a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game for the NES. This game is probably the worst, if not the worst, to age water level in any platformer. The level requires a lot of patience, which would be fine if the level itself wasn't bland and on a timer. Enemies really only consist of thin veils of electricity, a rotating bar, and occasional dangerous coral that feels near impossible to navigate through due to its very tight, liberating space that doesn't allow damage on the player. The persistent wait and go game you undergo when playing this level makes the game feel like a chore. To me, it doesn't seem like the best design is to have people exercise their patience through a level that is timed. It creates unnecessary and extremely stressful confusion deciding when to swim through barricades. This level is so crappy that there are a lot of playthroughs online where people just kind of swim through the obstacles, taking damage, relying on healing inventory items just to recharge their health as they go through the level. If a player is just blindly getting hit to expedite through a level, it's kind of fair to say the level is so bad that players don't feel incentivized to navigate through it as it's intended to. I think the frosting on this really crappy cake also especially comes from the lack of major mechanic changes in the water segment level itself. There's no real enemy NPCs, no new attacks, no new weapons. All TMT provides underwater is the same flutter system we saw in Mario Brothers, but worse. The whole thing feels like a waste of time in your adventure. Now, I want to talk about another game that has a stark difference, but uses it in a very interesting way, and that's Sonic. Sonic Skateboard. Now, many of you probably cringe when I mention water and Sonic for a good reason. Segments of water in Sonic just never felt good because it tremendously slows down Sonic, which is kind of the main purpose of playing a Sonic game. But I don't think the water segments are all that bad because the Sega team designed water levels in Sonic via a very unique lens: negative reinforcement. In Sonic games, the objective for nearly every level is to move through the courses as fast and as flashy as possible. The classical games in particular throughout the years have awarded players for moving swiftly with a very clever 3-tier system. The highest route Sonic can use to stay on course will denote as A. The middle course running through the middle will denote as B. Finally, the lowest route at these courses will denote as C. A, the highest route, is the quickest yet hardest to stay on. B, the middle route, is a bit slower and more forgiving to use than A. And C, the absolute bottom route, is the slowest route and typically where bodies of water are found. It's here in C where water slows down Sonic's speed tremendously and makes his jump much more floaty. However, Sega was very wise in adding a new mechanic to these water sections, and that was a timer and lack of oxygen. The infamous timer that carries that really foreboding tune in the Sonic games creates a sense of dread anxiety. We all know it. The moment you hear it, you just feel like goosebumps and a feeling of just urgency to escape the water. If the players don't come up for air, Sonic obviously drowns as the music comes to a crescendo and the timer counts down to 0. Sega here is using the water as a negative reinforcement tool. Instead of leaning into the shitty water system and inventing a new way to navigate the water like in Mario or Zelda, Sonic makes the players' lives a living hell in these segments. The stress from this experience motivates players to stay on high paths and try to master these courses, aiming for that high adrenaline rush Sega was aiming to instill in their gameplay. It's a very smart use of water as a deterrent and not a bonus. In later years, games like Sonic Generations would even award the player an achievement if Chemical Plant Zone was cleared without even touching water. Also, I know there's items in Sonic that allow Sonic to breathe underwater and allow him to get hit without, losing his rings. But still, regardless, I think that stress and feeling of vulnerability is still there even with those items. Alright, so let's talk action and adventure games. And I want to first talk about the worst level in probably any game in this genre, and that's Atlantica. Atlantica in Kingdom Hearts is a terrible experience to relive through for any seasoned KH vet. Kingdom Hearts is a game that already has its fair share of issues with platforming. Even now in my 20s, there are words like Hollow Bastion that I can't for the life of me consistently navigate. I fall down to what I always assumed to be the latrine of Hollow Bastion whenever I try jumping onto platforms, which I don't think is my fault. I just think KH has a very strange jump movement system that you learn very early on in Deep Jungle will not get better. Fuck Deep Jungle, by the way. I really hate Deep Jungle. Probably, no, not as bad as Atlantica, but still, I really hate Deep Jungle. Sora's jump is very floaty and hard to pinpoint when it comes to landing. I say all this to say movement is not a strong KH mechanic. So one of the worst things this game did was introduce an entire world of water, where movement would be even more challenging. In Atlantica, Sora and crew are transformed into aquatic creatures with new swimming mechanics. However, this swimming is very clunky, and it's not for the same reasons you would see in Mario or Sonic. There's no floaty jump or slow movement. If anything, Sora should control well because he swims as a literal mermaid. Unfortunately, the movement is very clunky because it serves 2D movement in a 3D environment. What do I mean by that? Okay, Look at the entry room of the world. It's a lot of 3D space that misleadingly seems free to navigate. I can move forward of sword down the x-axis, y-axis, and z-axis. However, I can only rotate along the z-axis, but not along either the x nor the y. So you end up getting this uncomfortable feeling of being in a 3D space, but not, if that makes sense. If I wanted to go to the top of the level, Sora would tilt his body up like a normal human being, but instead, in this game, he kind of floats straight up as if he's a dead goldfish in a fish tank. It's really strange. This is all due to that fixed camera around the axis that I mentioned earlier of Kingdom Hearts. It doesn't have the ability to navigate freely behind the player's POV like you would in a game like Deep Diving Simulator. Look it up, it's a real game. It just feels terrible and provides for really awful control. Imagine if in Super Mario 64, Mario would move like Sora in these water levels and couldn't tilt his body to reach for coins or switches in certain areas. It would be hard, and I mean very hard, to ever get all 8 red coins, and the game would be trashed for it. Not to mention, the segments in Atlantica are so copy-paste, and the space is so large to operate with nearly nothing to do. It feels like a waste of a well-known and beloved Disney World. Also unrelated, I hate the rhythm segments. They're not challenging, they're not creative. They just feel like a waste of space. And I wish I can just talk about that for 20 minutes because I just have such seething hatred for all those rhythm segments in Atlantica. Alright, Ocarina of Time. The moment many of you probably expected from the name of this video, the Water Temple. I love Ocarina of Time. Top 5 game of all time for me, and I still think it did a fantastic job of laying the blueprint for a lot of 3D action adventure games, even outside Nintendo. However, bias aside, I have to admit the Water Temple in Ocarina of Time is poorly designed and universally hated for a good reason. Immediately upon entering the temple, you're met with a large body of water surrounding the base, I guess you would call it, with only one route of progression, which is diving into said water. Diving is the main crux of this level. This mechanic isn't done in the traditional sense. Link doesn't use his Zora tunic to freely navigate the water like you do in Ocarina of Time's successor, Twilight Princess. Instead, Link is expected to use his iron boots and navigate the bottom of the ocean floor and unequip the iron boots to swim back up the surface. There's so many issues with the design. I don't know what they were thinking when this got through to production. The biggest issue is these damn iron boots. They're items you can't assign a shortcut to. As in, the only way to equip and unequip the iron boots is by opening and closing the start menu and navigating to your inventory. Fair to say this gets old very fast, and you need to do it a lot in this temple. The Water Temple also has Link uses Ocarina in multiple sections to raise and lower the water level of the temple to help explore new areas. It's a really shitty trope that gets old fast, especially when considering it's a negative consequence of Link's inability to swim freely in bodies of water. Link is also subject to only use his hookshot and sword underwater, as bombs, arrows, etc. are all deemed unusable when submerged for some reason. The entire experience feels like a net negative. Link's mobility is limited, the chores of the temple are tedious, the iron boots suck ass to equip, and the final boss does not capitalize on anything interesting or new to utilize in the water in the temple. It's a shame because they could have had Link use his ice arrows, which you get so late in this game for some reason, to manipulate the water, or have Link fight Dark Link submerged in water with new fighting mechanics, or just left the stupid iron boots away from this temple. It's such a huge disappointment. Alright, so I talked about really shitty examples a lot in this video, but there are really good games out there that actually do water levels justice, because they don't focus on just making it a one-to-one replica of what humans actually do in bodies of water. They explore something called creativity and actually tap into mechanics that work. I think the first one we should talk about, which is a video game I think a lot of people think of when they think of good water levels, is Donkey Kong Country. It had to be mentioned for Coral Capers. It's an iconic water level that does what many platforms at the time dreamt of doing. First and foremost, the levels remove any negative reinforcement mechanic like the drowning in Sonic, but instead leading to making a new method of gameplay that is actually fun. The level does share similarities with Mario water levels, in that the fast-paced strolling of the 2D adventure beforehand slows down for a low-tempo swim. However, Donkey Kong Country does this in a lot more consumable and a witty fashion. DKC is very wise in that the level forces you through smaller partitioned sections to enforce players to stay on a predetermined path, almost like what TMNT tries to do for the NES. It's easier to navigate and anticipate enemies, not to mention the addition of a rideable swordfish adds another level of speed and combat in these levels. It's a very well designed and near perfect level when you factor in its beautiful ambient track. I know we haven't focused too much on the music in this video, but I have to talk about it. It's gorgeous, it puts you at ease, and helps associate the water level with a pleasant feeling. Unlike, that tune from Sonic the Hedgehog. Future Donkey Kong Country levels would enforce a faster gameplay flow in water levels, giving Donkey Kong an additional boost mechanic, all to better match the fast-paced action of the entire game. These faster-paced levels still share predetermined quarter routes, but they do it with a lot more open space and flexibility, offering a very cool, new, fun swim style that works for the games. It's funny enough, a very similar style to the next example I want to talk about, which is Rayman Legends. Holy shit, Rayman Legends is probably the best game when it comes to water level platformers. Also, in general, great platform game. You should just look it up and play it if you haven't. I feel like it's still underrated, even though it has probably won awards. I feel like more people should be playing it and talking about it. Rayman Legends water levels are designed perfectly. Despite the presence of water, Rayman's movement doesn't take any noticeable consequences, and by design feels one-to-one to his movement on land. On land, Rayman moves left to right and uses the sprint button to sprint. Underwater, he moves at the same walk speed throughout a more free body of space, and has the ability to heighten his speed with the same sprint button. It's not like DK's boost feature, even though he does have that too to attack, but more so a second gear that Rayman can use to quickly fly through areas where speed is incentivized. There's never a patient segment where Rayman has to wait or squeeze by an enemy slowly. There's no vulnerability, no floatiness, no slowness. Rayman feels just as free to use in the water as he does on land, providing adrenaline-like segments, like in Sonic, against bosses or fast reaction time based obstacles. It's very fun and shows how developers don't have to sacrifice and stay true to this real-world water physics engine. If water physics aren't fun, then simply change it up. We all wish we can speed through water like an underwater torpedo in real life, so why not let the player just do that in your game? Now, on to action-adventure games. I think there's two good examples of games in this genre that utilize a mechanic that is perfect for traversing water levels in this genre, and that's the transformation mechanic. Now, what do I mean by transformation mechanic? It's a mechanic that I feel like I can attribute to any moment in a game where a character transforms their person into a completely new model that has new mechanics and new playstyles. Think about Mario Odyssey and Majora's Mask. Super Mario Odyssey itself deserves its own video, praising its ability to let Mario become seamlessly anything in the Mario universe. A frog, a car, Bullet Bill, etc. But I'm here to talk about its water segments specifically, obviously. In Odyssey, Mario controls well, but like most games, is still limited and really boring in bodies of water. Limited oxygen, slower movement, rough coordination, etc, etc. But this is made up for Mario's ability to become a Cheep Cheep. The Cheep Cheep removes oxygen necessity and introduces a context-sensitive adjustment to water controls. As Mario's now a fish, navigating any coordinate of the 3D open world is simple, without a constricting camera angle of KH or slow body rotations of the original Super Mario 64 game. Speaking of KH, this is the control schema and mechanic layout that Atlantica wish it had. Now let's take it one step further. Majora's Mask. How can one combine the best of the transformation mechanics along with the core mechanics the player has learned along the way in their adventure? Great Bay Temple is how! I love this level. This level, despite its split reception, is a very, very well designed Zelda dungeon. Majora's Mask is a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time, and it shows. Link no longer relies on iron boots and the repetitive equip workflow that you saw a lot in the Water Temple. Instead, Link, like in many other dungeons, relies on his mask that transforms his body into one of 3 key Zelda species: Deku's, Goron's, and Zora's. The Zora mask unlocks a whole new game in Majora's Mask. With the mask equipped, Link can now breathe underwater, dive as deep as possible, fight using boomerang-like fins, propel himself with a swim boost like Rayman and Donkey Kong, and even more cool, create a magic meter-based force field when swimming fast. That's so sick, dude. The Zora Link model is genius, and it allows Link to fight in new ways around the temple, while also not sacrificing speed nor time in the inventory menu. The Great Bay Temple wisely also depends on Human Link, as Human Link is the only playable model that can use arrows. Why are the arrows so important? It's not as important as the arrows used in the Water Temple and Ocarina of Time for hitting switches. It's more so a mechanic that the player relies on to manipulate the environment around them. You can use ice arrows to freeze pillars of water and waterfalls to cut momentum to gears and switches. It's like a 180 of the Water Temple in Ocarina of Time. Link would tediously take out his ocarina and play Zelda's lullaby to change the water level. Instead, now the game lets you freely cut and supply water to certain segments of the temple using a core mechanic of ice arrows to ultimately decide the best flow of water you need to progress. The temple is genius, and just how it brings it all together. It brings out the best in the transformation mechanic, fighting, swimming, diving, the freedom to navigate this body of water, while also bringing out a staple core mechanic of shooting arrows to allow players to freely manipulate the environment around them. It serves to be a memorable temple and level, for good or for bad, but for sure, a very unique and creative way to design a level. And that's it. I mean, there's a lot more other levels I can probably get into, but I don't want to make this video into 300 minutes long on every single water level possible. I just want to talk about the most notable examples of the good and bad. I do think that developers can make a good water level. It is very challenging, but it is possible. As long as that creativity is there to really get away from relying on real physics-based or real-life physics-based water mechanics, I think we can easily get there, and you can see that in these examples. Anyway, Simon from the Panic Brothers. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please let me know what you think in the comments. What is your favorite water level? What is your least favorite water level? And until next time, I'll see you really soon. Bye!